The USA PATRIOT Act is one of the most important acts of legislation in modern history. USA PATRIOT is an acronym for Uniting and Strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism. Problem identified. On the morning of September 11, 2001, the United States was attacked. Two planes were flown into the World Trade Center towers in New York City. One plane was aimed for either the White House or Capitol, crashed in Pennsylvania, and another plane flew into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. These deliberate acts of terror clearly identified a major problem with regards to the United States. That problem was the lack of security, specifically when examining law enforcement agencies' ability to search telephone, email communications, medical, financial, and other records when there were matters of national security. Basically, they needed an act that would give the government the right to infringe on people's civil liberties in order to tighten security and attempt to prohibit another attack like the ones on September 11th from happening again. At the time, the public was very in favor of it as the attack had upset the U.S. and disrupted the thought process that the U.S. is invincible. Some people were concerned with it, however, including many senators and congresspeople, afraid it would infringe too much on people's civil liberties. One such example was Representative John Conyers, Jr. of Michigan, ranking Democrat on the Judiciary Committee. He stated, "We need to do everything in our power to end the blight of terrorism everywhere around the world, but we must remember that just as this horrific act could destroy us from without, it could also destroy us from within." Attorney General John Ashcroft, however, was in favor of it and pushed it to try and get it passed with the utmost urgency in the wake of 9/11. Agenda setting. Congress knew that it had to act in order to prevent another such act of terror from happening, and they sought to address a few issues specifically. The primary focus was on reinforcing the arsenal of tools available to the Central Intelligence Agency, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and federal prosecutors for identifying and disabling terrorist networks operating both within and outside the United States. In order to push forward with the agenda, President Bush addressed the media about the act and gave speeches about the necessary steps needed in order to ensure that the terrorism experienced on September 11th would not occur again. Also, the responsibility of drafting the bill was delegated to Assistant Attorney General Viet Dinh, and charged with introducing the bill was Representative Jim Sensenbrenner. Viet Dinh. Viet Dinh assumed the position of Assistant Attorney General in April of 2001 and was called upon in September of 2001 to draft one of the most important pieces of legislation in our nation's history in the USA PATRIOT Act. It can be said that the chief architect of the USA PATRIOT Act was a hard-working individual who put in a lot of time and effort when his country needed him most. Dinh can be quoted as saying, "Congress was very involved with the process in refining, adding, and sometimes deleting some of our proposals. The USA PATRIOT Act served a very, very central purpose, that is, to update the law to the technology, so that the terrorist and other criminals with criminal and harmful intent cannot evade investigations simply by switching cell phones or changing from phone to internet." Jim Sensenbrenner. Jim Sensenbrenner introduced the USA PATRIOT Act to the House of Representatives on October 23, 2001. It was introduced as a method to help keep America safe by enhancing the tools our law enforcement officials could use to thwart another terrorist attack. Jim Sensenbrenner introduced the act, but he did not write it as Viet Dinh was still the author. Policy formulation. Congress decided that these ideas should be what the act is based on. To dramatically reduce restrictions on law enforcement agencies' ability to search telephone, email, communications, medical, financial, and other records. To erase restrictions on foreign intelligence gathering within the United States. To expand the Secretary of the Treasury's authority to regulate financial transactions, particularly those involving foreign individuals and entities. to broaden the discretion of law enforcement and immigration authorities in detaining and deporting immigrants suspected of terrorism-related acts, to expand the definition of terrorism to include domestic terrorism, to reduce the amount of terrorist attacks on the U.S., to increase the security of every U.S. citizen. Civil libertarian think tank the Cato Institute opposed the Patriot Act due to its infringement upon people's civil liberties and the invasion of privacy. The proposed bills. Combating Terrorism Act of 2001. The first bill proposed was the Combating Terrorism Act of 2001, which was introduced by Republican Senators Orrin Hatch and John Keel, with Democratic Senators Dianne Feinstein and Chuck Schumer on September 13th. This bill did many things, those including it ordered a report on the readiness of the National Guard to preemptively disrupt domestic acts of terrorism that used weapons of mass destruction, and called for long-term research and development into terrorist attacks. Also, it called for a review of the authority of federal agencies to address terrorist attacks. It proposed a change that would have allowed the CIA to recruit terrorist informants. It proposed to allow law enforcement agencies to disclose foreign intelligence that was discovered through wiretaps and other interception methods. It proposed a sense of Congress that not enough was being done to impede and investigate terrorist fundraising, and sought to increase measures to prevent the laundering of the proceeds of terrorism. The Public Safety and Cybersecurity Enhancement Act. The Public Safety and Cybersecurity Enhancement Act was introduced on September 20th to the House by Republican Representative Lamar Smith. Its main focus was on the unauthorized access of protected computers and proposed making modifications to the laws based on the Cable TV Privacy Act surrounding cable TV subscriber privacy, as well as various changes to PIN register and trap and trace laws. The bill would have made an exception for foreign intelligence gathering in the laws that require a court order necessary for PIN register and trap and trace surveillance. It would also have removed restrictions on the prohibition of gaining access to cable television subscriber records and only prohibited the disclosure of viewing patterns of cable television subscribers. Intelligence to Prevent Terrorism Act. The Intelligence to Prevent Terrorism Act was introduced to the Senate on September 28th by Senators Bob Graham and Jay Rockefeller. It proposed a number of changes relating to the Director of Central Intelligence, or the DCI. The most significant change proposed was to require the Attorney General or head of any other federal department or agency to disclose to the DCI any foreign intelligence acquired in the course of a criminal investigation. The bill would also have required that the DCI and the Secretary of the Treasury jointly report to Congress on whether it would be a good idea to reconfigure the Office of Foreign Assets Control and its Foreign Terrorist Asset Tracking Center to provide for the analysis and dissemination of foreign intelligence relating to the financial capabilities and resources of international terrorist organizations. Another area it covered was a proposal to make the Attorney General provide a program of training to government officials regarding the identification and use of foreign intelligence. Anti-Terrorism Act of 2001. Among other things, the administration proposal discussed extending roving wiretaps from the just domestic agencies into the area of foreign intelligence surveillance, and it proposed the expansion of the use of wiretaps from phone lines to internet technology. It would have made it possible for more law enforcement agencies to distribute wiretap information, and would have expanded the scope of surveillance subpoenas to allow broader access to personal records, including books, records, papers, documents, and other items. Both the Intelligence to Prevent Terrorism Act and the proposed Anti-Terrorism Act draft were referred to the Select Committee on Intelligence. Financial Anti-Terrorism Act. The Financial Anti-Terrorism Act was a bill later to be incorporated into the final USA PATRIOT Act. It was introduced in the middle of October by Republican Representative Mike Oxley and was passed and then referred to the Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. It proposed strengthening financial law enforcement through a number of measures. These included establishing FinCEN, or Financial Crime Enforcement Network, as a bureau of the Department of the Treasury, enhancing forfeiture laws and preventing the structuring of transactions to bypass anti-money laundering and reporting legislation. It also proposed establishing measures to increase the cooperation between the public and private sectors when it came to reporting and preventing financial crimes such as money laundering, along with further measures to combat international money laundering. The USA PATRIOT Act. The first version of the Patriot Act was introduced into the House on October 2, 2001, as the Provide Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Patriot Act of 2001, and was later passed by the House as the Uniting and Strengthening America USA Act on October 12th. This was based on the Anti-Terrorism Act, but had been changed after negotiations and work between Attorney General Ashcroft, Senators Lee, Bob Graham, and Orrin Hatch, among others. It was introduced into the Senate as the USA Act of 2001, where Senator Russ Feingold, a Democrat from Wisconsin, the only senator to vote against the passing of the bill when it came to a vote, proposed a number of amendments, none of which were passed. Feingold's concerns included the way that the bill was trying to be passed without much time, the aspects of the wiretapping provisions, the changes to search and seizure laws, the expanded powers under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act that allowed law enforcement to gain access to business records, and the changes to detention and deportation laws for immigrants. The USA Patriot Act was introduced into the House on October 23rd. It incorporated many of the provisions of the Financial Anti-Terrorism Act. Though there were some objections and concerns raised about the legislation, a motion to suspend the rules and pass the bill was passed. Policy legitimization. The USA Patriot Act was the proposal selected for passage by Congress. It was a revision of the Anti-Terrorism Act, but included provisions both parties discussed and deemed necessary. As for public support, the terrorist attacks of September 11th had everybody scared to death that something like that could happen again at any time if no action was taken. Therefore, Congress passed the bill, though some would argue in a rushed way, in order to get it passed and prevent any further acts of terror from happening. It was rushed to signing in both houses and passed with ease on account of a 357 to 66 passing in the House and a 98 to 1 passing in the Senate. The enacting of the USA Patriot Act from the time of the dreadful terrorist attacks to the signing into law by President Bush only took 46 days. On October 26, 2001, President Bush signed it into law in the White House's East Room. Policy implementation. Multiple agencies were reformed/created with the passing of the Patriot Act. Some changes included establishing a fund for counter-terrorist activities and increased funding for the FBI's Technical Support Center. Another was that the military was authorized to provide assistance in some situations that involved weapons of mass destruction when so requested by the Attorney General. Also, the National Electronic Crime Task Force was expanded, along with the President's authority and abilities in cases of terrorism. The Act expanded the Secretary of the Treasury's authority to regulate financial transactions, particularly those involving foreign individuals and entities. And finally, an establishment of the National Virtual Translation Center. Policy evaluation. The USA Patriot Act did a lot of good things for the United States, but at the same time it angered a lot of organizations as well. The ACLU and the Cato Institute in particular both opposed the USA Patriot Act due to its infringement on civil liberties in order to strengthen security in the aftermath of September 11th. The media played a big role in the evaluation, presenting the negatives of the act, including with publicizing trials like Ashcroft v. Al-Kid and ACLU v. NSA. In both of these, the main quarrel related directly to the USA Patriot Act and its policy. Due to these problems, and many more like them, proposals to change the USA Patriot Act were made. Many bills were introduced in order to attempt to change the content within the USA Patriot Act. Some of these bills included Protecting the Rights of Individuals Act, Benjamin Franklin True Patriot Act, and the Security and Freedom Insured Act, among others. These acts all sought to review the provisions of the USA Patriot Act and change them in order to better protect the civil liberties of the people, which were clearly being infringed upon. The USA Patriot Act was designed with sunsets, where by a certain date parts of the act would expire unless reauthorized by Congress and the President of the United States. President Bush believed wholeheartedly that the act was doing its job of increasing security and preventing more terrorist attacks from occurring. Therefore, he went around campaigning for the act. In his 2004 State of the Union address, he said, "Inside the United States, where the war on terror began, we must continue to give our homeland security and law enforcement personnel every tool they need to defend us. And one of those essential tools is the Patriot Act." This quote clearly embodied his view on the act, and he eventually was able to gain reauthorization of it, however with a few changes. Several of the amendments made to the act were to surveillance provisions and included an amendment that added to the list of terrorist crimes that could be used for obtaining electronic surveillance the requirement that the director of the FBI must personally approve any library or bookstore request by the FBI under Section 215, making law enforcement report back to a court within 15 days of using the roving wiretap, and the narrowing of the scope for sneak and peek delayed notification search warrants. After delaying the reauthorization of the act due to disputes upon the changes made, Congress extended the deadline for 1 month, then another month, and finally on March 2nd, the Senate successfully passed the Reauthorization Act and the President signed it on March 8, 2005. Another reauthorization bill was signed in February 2006, amending the first Reauthorization Act. Then, in 2010, President Obama reauthorized 3 controversial sections of the act for 1 year. Those sections being the ability to authorize court-approved roving wiretaps that permit surveillance on multiple phones, the ability to allow court-approved seizure of records and property in anti-terrorism operations, and the permitting of surveillance against a so-called lone wolf, a non-U.S. citizen engaged in terrorism who may not be part of a recognized terrorist group. With sunsets looming large once again, President Obama reauthorized the USA PATRIOT Act on May 26, 2011, with 3 specific provisions being reauthorized for 4 more years. Those provisions being roving wiretaps, searches of business records, the library records provision, and conducting surveillances of lone wolves, individuals suspected of terrorist-related activities not linked to terrorist groups.